Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for tuning into Kosher Musalman. This is the second part of our conversation with Professor Salman Sayyid. Professor Salman Sayyid is a professor of political theory and decolonial thought at University of Leeds. In the previous podcast with him, we spoke about Islam, Kashmir, and colonialism. And in this podcast, we'll be talking about secularism, decoloniality, and Kashmir. So, Professor, there are certain people who are quick to assert that the issue or the struggle that's ongoing in Kashmir is not a religious struggle, it's a political struggle. But my problem with that argument is that doesn't this distinction or dichotomy of religious being a separate, privatized realm of life and the political being the public realm of life, doesn't this distinction have a particular context in European Enlightenment history? And if so, then why is this distinction being introduced to read the struggle of a people who do not locate themselves within European history and do not see themselves and their struggle in terms of Western discourse? Isn't this a problematic thing to do?
Yes, I think it's problematic, and I would say it's probably absurd. But it's a dominant way of talking about these things by dividing between the political and what is called religious. Now, when they mean religious, they mean Muslim. Clearly, what the struggle in most cases where they say are religious struggles are not religious in the sense there is about the struggle around matters of theological dispute. It is about existential threat. And when they make that distinction between the political and the religion, and sometimes nowadays, because they want to be decolonial, they do this as a kind of a critique of Eurocentrism. But of course, like you point out, one of the main points of Eurocentric epistemology is precisely the idea of a division between religion and politics, between what is supposed to be Caesar's and what is supposed to be Christ's. Now, most things which are called religion now don't have such a strong distinction of that. Hinduism, Judaism, etc. It doesn't make any sense. And if you look, the problem starts with the category of religion. If you look at the first English translation of the Quran, authoritative translation, it translates deen not into religion, because the concept of religion didn't exist at the time, but into sacred law. And in fact, the idea of law, which is, you could see the kind of commonalities between Judaic or Hindu kind of things, dharma, in a way that captured something, or nomus or custom. It's only with the invention of the category of religion that deen becomes translated into religion, and Islam then becomes a religion. And if I said to you, there's a difference between the political and the law, it becomes unsustainable. So I agree with you, totally on this, that to say that this is not a religious struggle or this is not a political struggle, it's really simply a struggle for freedom and a struggle for emancipation. And in that, what is to be emancipated is Muslimness. Could there be a Kashmiri emancipation which did not include the ability to express their Muslimness as they may wish to do so? And the answer surely would be no. So it is not clear what kind of liberation would exist in which Kashmiris could not express their Muslimness. So I think, this kind of, this is a struggle that's often being faced, that basically what you have is an attempt to invalidate projects of liberation and emancipation by arguing that they are somehow illegitimate because of this distinction between the religion and the political. And in fact, this is not only a problem, as you know, in Kashmir, it's also, the scandal in India where protests about students which have been told not to use anything Muslim. Even though Muslims are being attacked, they should not talk about Muslimness, but it is Muslimness that is being attacked. So not talking about Muslimness makes you complicit with the attack rather than someone who wants to defeat those attacks. You become complicit with the oppression and the repression rather than someone who's trying to undo that repression.
Exactly, and speaking of secularism, I think it's important to note that when it comes to Kashmiri Muslims, they constitute the other not just in the imagination of the proponents of Hindutva, but also in the imagination of Indian secular nationalists. So, for the Indian secular nationalists, the problem with Kashmiri Muslims is that they don't identify with the idea of secular India, that Kashmiri Muslims don't want to be a part of secular India. For the proponents of Hindutva, the problem with Kashmiri Muslims is that they disrupt the fantasy of an Akhand Bharat or a greater sacred India. But both the Indian secular nationalists and the proponents of Hindutva believe that there is something wrong with Kashmiri Muslims and that Kashmiri Muslims need to be tamed by violence if necessary. So it's important to understand that when it comes to the occupation of Kashmir, it transcends the local political contestations in India. In all the ideas of India, whether secular or non-secular, Kashmir's occupation remains integral. And one must not exceptionalize Modi the same way Hitler was exceptionalized in Europe. And this is something that Indian liberals have been doing. They have been presenting Modi as an exception, when in fact, the violence against Muslims, the systemic violence, the dehumanization and the otherization of Muslims has been a norm in India. When in fact, the occupation of Kashmir began not in 2014 when Modi came into power, but in 1947. So, Professor, in your book, you have critiqued secularism and you view secularism as a discursive and a political formation through which the behavior of Muslims is regulated, through which Muslims are domesticated, and through which any assertion of Muslim political subjectivity is criminalized. Please tell us your thoughts about all this.
Well, I mean, I think it's quite clear that secularism has two sort of important points to it. One, its story about itself is based entirely on a Eurocentric reading of European history. So the argument, as you know, goes that in Europe they had wars of religion, and they ended the wars of religion by agreeing that societies should be secular and there should be separation between church and state. And we have had almost 50 years, or if not more, of attempts by others to try and separate church and state in the Islamisphere. Now, the problem with that is they first have to find the church. They can't find the church, so one of the ironies of secularists is that they have to invent a church. So take Mustafa Kemal. In order to secularize the Turkish Republic, he had to set up a ministry which took over control of all Muslim institutions of religion, worship, learning, etc. So rather than being a separation of the church and state, you have a state invented church. Similarly, in the Soviet Union, they had muftis appointed by Soviet authorities. They have this kind of regulatory framework where the church is invested with particular kind of authority and legitimacy. Under colonial rule, the British, the French, the Dutch were always looking for compliant religious figures who they could then make and say that these people are religious spokesmen. They are like the priests, and they determine what it is. So one element of this is that secularism bases itself on trying to understanding itself on what happened in European history. But what happened in European history is not the same as what happened elsewhere. So it is not the case that under Muslim rule, which was basically Sharia law until the colonial order, people were worse off. In fact, a number of prominent historians would make the case that at least, and if not longer, than the Atlantic revolutions of the 18th and 19th century, if you were a person, if you were a minority, or if you were a dispossessed, or if you were a woman, or in any way you were not privileged, if you could choose to live under any regime, you would probably want to live under a Sharia compliant regime. And this is not a romanticism, and this is not to, to denigrate the various corruptions and inequalities and violences that occurred. But in that context of the world at that time, you were probably better protected or better able to negotiate under that assemblage of legal frameworks and protections, which were at least independent than many other places. So the argument for secularism right now in the current conjuncture is whenever people talk about secularism, they nearly always mean doing something about expressions of Muslimness, curtailing Muslimness. Whether that's in France or in Austria or in Eastern Turkestan or among the Burmese or in India. It's not about separating church from state. It is about regulating Muslimness.
So, Professor, when we speak of Muslim political subjectivity, or when we talk about the formation of a political community of Muslims that would transcend the national borders that we have today, or when we imagine the caliphate as a locus of Muslim political unity, immediately there are some people who are made very uncomfortable by this idea. And they criticize this idea by talking about how there are great cultural, ethnic, linguistic differences among Muslims. And they would start talking about how the Indonesian Muslim is very different from a Kashmiri Muslim. And for them, Indonesian Muslim is just an Indonesian who happens to be a Muslim. Similarly, a Kashmiri Muslim is a Kashmiri who just happens to be a Muslim. So for them, Muslimness is something that is superficial, that just exists on the surface. But the same people who criticize this idea of caliphate or this idea of a Muslim political subjectivity do not express the same level of discomfort when someone talks about, let's say, Pan-Africanism, despite the fact that within what we refer to as Africa, there is great diversity. Or when someone talks about third world solidarity, despite the fact that there is no cultural or linguistic uniformity in third world. Or when someone talks about working class uniting throughout the world, despite the fact that working class people do not all come from the same linguistic or ethnic group. Or when someone talks about feminism across the borders, despite the fact that women globally are not a monolith, they come from a wide variety of cultures. So why is it only that when Muslims speak of political unity or political subjectivity, or when they speak of transcending national borders, that everyone starts criticizing it and doubting this solidarity? What are your thoughts about this?
But I think the point is a fundamental one here, okay? So there is no logical locus which says this is the right kind of association we have, yeah? In the context of any political project, whether it's a struggle for intense, almost existential struggle like in Kashmir, or a struggle to get a road built or a school opened or something like that. Any political project has to involve other human beings. It has to be associative. And the more you are able to be part of the political project requires a certain kind of transcendence, a ability to go beyond your particular circumstances. That is what politics is about. Otherwise, there is no politics. So the idea, like you said quite rightly, people talk about third world solidarity and it doesn't make them nervous or queasy. They can talk about other forms of solidarities. It doesn't make them queasy. So the question we have to ask ourselves is that, what is it about the idea of Muslim solidarity that makes so many people queasy? And one answer may be, and I don't put it any stronger than a suggestion, perhaps what makes them queasy is the fact that it is the decolonial potential of that solidarity in the current circumstances. See, people always think about the decolonial as something something very kind of abstracted, something which is very kind of locked in. I don't think we realize how deeply the colonial formation of the world is. And while decolonization in some ways has taken place in the periphery, the real decolonization really has to take place, or has to be extended and deepened to take place in the metropole. But when you start talking about decolonizing the metropole, it makes people very, very nervous, because it is not only their hegemonic way of life, but it is a way of life that is projected to the world as being something to aspire to. So I think there is absolutely this kind of argument that, you know, a decolonial project worth its salt would make those who are invested in the privileges of this particular arrangement perhaps nervous, unless they are able to transcend those privileges and see themselves being part of a process of emancipation. So when they point out that Muslims in Jakarta are different from Muslims in Dakar, who are different from Muslims in Rio de Janeiro or wherever, it's as banal as saying something like this, that, you know, you and I are conversing in English, but English in Arkansas is different than English in Aligarh. Yes, and so what? So the point I'm trying to make here is this, that the issue of solidarity, building or different kinds of transnational solidarities, is really, really crucial. But the real point is this, and this is why the struggle is important. A lot of decolonial thinking is really against power. And I think this is a misunderstanding of what the process of decolonization is. If you look at the populations who are powerless, like the Kashmiris or the Palestinians or the Uyghurs or the Rohingyas, and you can multiply the examples, you wouldn't want to share their suffering, their fate. The point isn't to reject power, but to reconfigure power in different shapes and ways and possible. Because power is not only prohibitive, it's also productive. If you are serious about decolonization, if you're serious about decolonization, you have to then understand that it is about seizing power to allow yourself to be free. And that, without that, it is very, very difficult to take decoloniality seriously. And power is never just given. It has to be taken through the very different kinds of mechanisms for taking power. But we will live in a world now with this kind of neoliberal hegemony in which democracy, if it exists, has become a spectator sport. And the ability to imagine an alternative world, an alternative way of becoming, has become more and more circumscribed. And outside that circumscription, for reasons which are contingent rather than essential or intrinsic, there is Muslimness, which offers a glimmering of another kind of world, if it could be expressed. There are no guarantees that it can deliver on that. But right now, it seems to me that one of the most connected and engaged possibilities for human emancipation is Muslimness, because it allows the possibility to imagine something beyond the colonial, national, racial logics. It doesn't do this perfectly. It doesn't do this without error. It doesn't do this without ambiguity. But it gives that possibility. And in a world where there are no such, or very few such possibilities, I think it's important to grab onto those that exist and build them and use them to broaden the examples by which we can think of the future for all humanity.
Thank you so much, Professor Salman Sayyid, for joining us in this conversation. It was lovely listening to you and learning from you. Our conversation has come to an end. Thanks to all those who listen to this podcast. Allah Hafiz.